Recently in a comment I was asked what glue I use, and as you can see there's quite a few here, so why do I have so many? Which ones do I actually use? One of the interesting things was that it wasn't just one person who asked, I think it was about 3 comments asking what and why, but I will try and adhere to the topic on hand, so let's get stuck into it. I wanted to just quickly get these glues out of the way because these are specialty glues, they're not something I use all the time. Spray adhesive for things like templates, or that's actually pretty much all I use it for. I've got acrylic cement for gluing acrylic together, super glue for small patch jobs, melamine glue, which honestly I think this has passed its expiry date, so it's going to go out. You don't really need melamine glue. These two are somewhat more multi-purpose. The Titebond cold press glue is for veneering. The epoxy for whenever I need something that's going to be outdoors. Epoxy is generally a better option in my mind than a waterproof PVA, but it depends on the circumstance. Moving away from the specialty glues, these are your more general purpose wood glues that I use in my shop. The exception is the white PVA. It dries clear and you can use it for woodworking, but I typically use it for foam working. I glue up foam board to make board game organisers. It dries clear, so it's better than something that dries yellow and looks a bit weird on the white foam. That's why I have this. Could be used for woodworking. So that leaves us with these two options, and in this bottle, the ubiquitous glue bottle, I have Titebond Original or Titebond 1. It is yellow PVA, and this is what you'll see the majority of people using. These days I will typically use yellow PVA for 2 purposes. One, if I'm gluing up anything to do with sheet goods, so plywood or an MDF, I will use this. The other is for basically lamination glue-ups rather than joinery glue-ups. So why do I use this for lamination glue-ups rather than for joinery glue-ups? And there's a couple of reasons. First, this is cheap. PVA is pretty much the cheapest wood glue that you can get. So that means when you need a large volume of it for a lamination, which is typically 2 panels together or two boards together, you're covering a large surface area, this works out cheaper. In laminations rather than joinery, a lot of the issues associated with PVA aren't really issues. For example, the water in PVA will make the wood fibres swell very slightly. Now, in a lamination, when you're gluing up 2 boards together, that doesn't really matter if they swell slightly, they're still going to go together just fine. But in joinery, that small amount of swelling can make a really nice tight fitting joint a little bit too tight to fit together, and that means when you're gluing up a table or a cabinet carcass or whatever, you've got a dozen joints, you're really rushing against the clock to get everything seated properly, and you have to use a lot more force just to seat things because of the PVA. And time is another reason for a lamination. You're sticking those 2 boards together, there's not really a lot to get set up. You have your clamps ready to go, you're done. You don't really need to tweak it to be square or whatever, so you're not racing against the clock. PVAs often have quite a short open time, ranging from I think it's 7 minutes or so up to 15, maybe 20 minutes, depending on the flavour. You've got Titebond 1, 2, 3, and you've got the extend version of each of them. For a lamination, that's really not an issue. When you're gluing 2 boards together, you just need to clamp it and you're done. For complex joinery, when you've got multiple sides all coming together at once, that's when it can be a little bit more tricky as a one-man shop. So that brings us to hide glue. I happen to use Titebond's liquid hide glue. It happens to be Titebond or Franklin's oldest product rather than the PVA, which is interesting. I'm not particularly brand loyal. This works absolutely fine, but the only other brand I know of is Old Brown Glue, which is not readily available in Australia, and it has advantages and disadvantages, of course, like all glues do. So we'll cover the disadvantages first. It's a little bit more expensive, so that's why I reserve it for joinery glue. It takes a little bit longer to dry. PVA is great. If you glue something up, you can work on it within an hour or 2 if it is a warm day. Liquid hide glue, you probably want 4 to 8 hours, so it can slow you down. It does have a shorter shelf life than PVA, about 24 months I believe, but you can test fairly easily by getting a little bit between your fingers and doing what's called the spider web test, where you keep doing this tapping motion and eventually these strands will form, and if it makes the strands, it's good, and if it doesn't, it's not, and you can throw it in the garden. The final downside is that when it is cold, like it is here in Melbourne at the moment, this is very viscous, and the reverse, when it's quite warm, it's very, very runny. So when it's cold, if you've got a vest pocket, chuck it in there. If you don't, put it in some warm water before you use it. Put the whole bottle in and then it'll flow much easier. Whereas PVA will remain fairly low viscosity at any temperature. So it costs more, it expires more quickly, it has a bit of a funny smell, and at cold temperatures it's a little bit harder to use because you've got to warm it up first. The disadvantages don't sound that great. It must have some pretty amazing advantages, right? Kind of, yeah, actually. If you've ever had any sort of glue up anxiety where you're worried that you'll mess something up, this is the glue for you. It has some real advantages. As I mentioned, PVA will make a glue joint swell and then doesn't fit together quite as well, so you have to put in a lot more effort to actually get the parts to mate. This has the opposite effect and actually lubricates the joint, makes everything go in super easy. Not only that, it has about twice the open time of Titebond Original, so that really reduces the stress there. You're not feeling like you're rushing quite as much. And the cleanup is definitely one of its best properties. You can use just warm water and you've got no issues. But can't you do exactly the same with PVA? Use a wet rag and it cleans up fine? Yes, but also mostly no. If you do that to PVA, you'll often end up with PVA spread everywhere. Most people recommend you wait for it to skin over and then you can scrape it off that way. If you do wipe it down with a wet rag, you'll often get it into the pores of the wood, and if you're not cleaning that up afterwards, sanding it, scraping it, whatever, you can be left with actually quite a bit of glue that looks invisible until you apply wood finish, and then it really pops and goes this weird colour, and there's not many ways to get rid of that. Now that's not too much of an issue if you're laminating something up, tabletop, whatever, you're going to sand it anyway, you can get to all parts of it, no problem. But let's say you've got two pieces joined like that, getting into that corner might be really tricky, or let's say there's even a panel in here, then getting into that corner is even trickier again. And that's where PVA starts being a little bit annoying to use. That's where hide glue, where you can actually wipe it off properly and it doesn't go as fluoro under wood finish, is a real lifesaver. Now to demonstrate that, I've applied the white PVA, the yellow PVA and some liquid hide glue. You can see as they've now dried, we've got the clear PVA is actually fairly clear. It's darkened the wood, but not too much. The yellow PVA, well, it's yellow, and the hide glue actually kind of looks like wood finish. I'm not going to clean these up too much. I did spread them around, and we'll apply an oil-based finish just to see what happens. From this angle, it actually doesn't look too bad. There are some yellow streaks from the thickness of the glue that was applied. The white and the hide glue don't show up too much, but when we turn it on an angle, you can really start to see the three different glues really popping out. We've got the white PVA, you can see the big spot there. The yellow PVA, it's massive, and the difference in colour is quite noticeable on the finished wood. And then the liquid hide glue, it's about the same as the wood underneath it. So yeah, I mean, obviously there's this brown spot here because again, it was thick, and you'd clean that up, scrape it up, but it's the stuff that is smushed into the surface that is the real danger. There is one other advantage where hide glue, whether it's the liquid form or hot hide glue, it'll stick to itself. That might sound a little bit weird. If you're having to repair something, the surface where the glue needs to be repaired or the wood needs to be repaired has to be scraped spotlessly for PVA to have any hope. It needs that raw wood, whereas the hide glue, you do a good job of scraping it out, but you don't have to be quite as careful. That's why a lot of these traditional instruments are still using like traditional glues, because they can be repaired for decades, centuries on, and you want to give someone in the future the best chance of being able to repair it rather than having to throw the whole thing out. That's why I use liquid hide glue. It is more or less the Valium of glues. It doesn't cause me stress while gluing things up, and it's just easier to use even if it's a little bit slower. Thanks for watching.